Ladies and gentlemen, please remain standing for the singing of our national anthem.
Let's get Brexit done.
My administration has accomplished more than almost any administration in the history of our country.
Hello and welcome to Mid-Atlantic. I am Roifield Brown. Today we're talking about a scandal that didn't just explode out of nowhere. It's been quietly wired in, ignored, and then left to detonate right in the middle of a Labour government. The Peter Mandelson affair has ripped open some very uncomfortable questions about judgment, power, and who exactly Keir Starmer thinks he's governing with. Placing renewed trust in Mandelson wasn't just bad luck, it was a conscious choice, a massive misjudgment involving a man who is almost universally despised by Labour's own rank and file, and whose political career has always left a trail of unease behind it. So what does this mean for Labour as a governing party? What does this say about Starmer's instincts, his inner circle, and his understanding of the movement that he leads? And is this just a personal embarrassment or something far more corrosive for UK governance? To dig into all of this, we are joined by Steve O'Neill from London, Leah Brown from Broadstairs in Kent, and Mike Donoghue dialing in from Los Angeles.
Mr. Speaker, I asked the Prime Minister a very specific question. Did he know that Mandelson had continued his friendship with Epstein after the conviction? He says if he knew then what he knows now, but he did know. In January 2024, a journalist from the Financial Times informed the Prime Minister that Mandelson had stayed in Epstein's house even after that conviction for child prostitution. So did the Prime Minister conveniently forget this fact, or did he decide it was a risk worth taking?
Prime Minister.
Well, Mr. Speaker, as the House will expect, we went through a process. There was a due diligence exercise, and then there was security vetting by the security services. What was not known was the sheer depth and extent of the relationship. He lied about that to everyone for years. And new information was published in September, showing the relationship was materially different to what we'd been led to believe. When the new information came to light, I sacked him. But we did go through a due diligence exercise. The points that are being put to me were dealt with within that exercise.
Steve, I'm going to start with you. Starmer's now confided or confirmed in the Commons that he knew about the ongoing Mandelson-Epstein friendship at the time of his appointment. So what exactly was he thinking by appointing him to such a prestigious role as our US ambassador?
I mean, the word you used just then was judgment, and it seems obvious, given that what he knew and what has happened since, that this would blow up. We're just talking about judgment, that this seems obvious. Now, he can't have known quite to the extent, but he cannot have been thinking about this. He cannot have been giving this proper, or his team cannot have given this proper thought, because it seems so obvious that this was going to come back to bite them and wasn't worth it. All the reporting is that they thought Mandelson was this unique talent who was absolutely needed to run the relationship with Trump. And I'm not sure that stands up either, because I believe the ambassador before him was doing quite a good job on that. But that was the narrative, and they were just willing to trade off on this, on some of these moral and reputational things. It's completely backfired. I'm trying to get my head around it, is the truth. I'm struggling.
Leah, I'm going to come to you. Is this fundamentally a vetting scandal, a judgment failure, or a cultural failure? Peter Mandelson, as I always remember, it was always like the Lord of Darkness. Labour rank and file never liked him. He always seemed to be cozying up to the rich and the powerful. He's the most un-Labour-like MP back in the day, the first few times he was kind of sacked and booted out of government. What level of failure is this, other than a complete and utter failure?
I think there's no question as to how significant a failure, both in judgment and in vetting, this is. But I also think, for all of Peter's shortcomings, he was probably the most experienced around the table in terms of how to navigate the political system, the relationships, whatever quid pro quo has led Labour to be in the particular situation that it's in today. And so I can see how number 10 fell for the allure. I can see how it was possible to overlook in the context. I think if you wind back to the precarious nature of the UK-US relationship at the time, which is in a totally different ballgame than where we are at the moment, I think the decision was felt to be fraught. It wasn't a slam dunk or a foregone conclusion. I'm not justifying that decision at all because I think it never ought to have been made. But I can see how a justification could have been put to the Prime Minister that would have led him to override his instincts or whatever professional judgment you would expect a Prime Minister to exercise in circumstances like these. And I also think that there is a naivety here where there was an expectation that, oh, well, it'll just be fine. And I just don't understand why the risk assessment didn't lend itself to further exploration of the potential issues and possibly even documenting that risk assessment so that he could perhaps fall back on it when the inevitable did eventually come to pass.
Mike, I do not ask you a question about the American perception of what's actually going on over here. But before I come on to that, I want to come back to you, Steve, because what does this say about our internal processes of actually vetting? Because this evening, I was watching a Channel 4 Dispatches documentary from 2019 that said that Peter Mandelson then had lied about how close his relationship was with Jeffrey Epstein post Epstein's conviction in 2008. So this is back in 2019, a Channel 4 Dispatches program, which seemed to say that, no, this relationship continued and was pretty close and intimate.
Yeah, and my experience of it always was within government, you had a pretty strong vetting process. Way back in the day when I started my career, I went through a vetting to be a civil servant. Whether that is actually weaker than one would think, I don't know. But the thing that strikes me also is that you can have a process, but ultimately someone makes the decision and can override the process. And so at some point, if people aren't following the norms of this person has these things in their background, they shouldn't be in this role. I wonder if the process itself can sort of save you from that. And I was just thinking when Leah was speaking about, obviously the Prime Minister is the boss here, makes the judgment, but anyone in that senior role is reliant on people around them. And I think that is why a lot this week has been aimed at some of Starmer's aides, because in reality, someone will have to have advised the Premier or the CEO or whatever, and they will always miss things if that advice is bad. This is a bit too high profile to give that excuse, but that's obviously part of the story.
Just before I come on to Leah, is there a difference between vetting civil servants as opposed to politicians? Is it a case of a politician or an aspiring politician will have a trail on the internet, so you just basically just kind of like go Google that, as opposed to a civil servant where you need to do a deeper level of checking? Because you can say with the politician, well, if there's anything bad, it probably will have come out already. Would give a cursory Google search, they're good, type of thing.
I don't know. I would have thought there'd be a formulaic process where you have certain forms filled out and interviews done. And I would have thought that would be the same for a civil servant and would go up for things like a diplomat, like an ambassador. Where it would be a bit different, I would have thought, is something like a minister, because that's a political appointee in a slightly different way. So I don't know what it is for ambassadors. I'd be surprised if it wasn't, supposedly at least, pretty robust. Maybe others know those details a bit better.
So one of the things that comes to mind that I think it is worth raising at this juncture is that I think there are a couple of things going on here. So the first is that Epstein and Maxwell's operations were deplorable. There is no question about that. But I just want to be really clear that I don't think that it was Mandelson's association with Epstein's activities that has led to this scandal. So one of the challenges here is that he was very quick to come out and say, I'm a gay man. I obviously haven't had any dealings with any of the women or the girls or the children who were involved in this scandal. But what has transpired was that the nature of Mandelson's relationship with Epstein was problematic as relates to state secrets, possibly national security, but particularly due to market-sensitive information. And what I'm wondering is why so much of the conversations about vetting has focused on national security rather than the nature of the criminal conduct that Mandelson is actually accused of and potentially will be found guilty of as the investigation concludes. And I think it's almost embarrassing for us that we're in this kind of, you asked Roifield whether this is a cultural issue. I think it absolutely is a cultural issue because we're not upset about the things that we ought to be upset about in this situation. And I think as news continues to unfold and as guilt continues to be applied to different parties who have had various responsibilities for decisions, we're not outraged enough at how this has come to pass in the first place. And I think there are a lot of people who are holding on to a huge amount of rage, who have a reckoning that they want the score to be set right. And I think we have barely even seen the beginning of it.
Isn't part of the reason why possibly there is some level of confusion about where exactly we should be attributing our anger to is there's so many places to that. Number one, here is somebody, and I'm talking about Epstein now, who is somebody who wasn't just incredibly odious in terms of practices of what he did. It was trying to understand how he was so networked and so protected for so long. There is that. Then there is the character of Mandelson himself, who, as I said in my intro, rank and file Labour members never liked him from the 1997 election of Blair. He was always seen as almost anti-Labour. He was somebody who did cozy up to large money interests, and he was never personally liked by the rank and file. That's not to say that some MPs didn't necessarily see him as an effective operator and communicator. And then, so because he was kind of distrusted, the fact that he was then put in this position by Starmer shocked many Labour MPs who just didn't like the man. And then there is the whole kind of state secrets thing. Now, he broke the trust of Gordon Brown and his colleagues. So there's so many different aspects to this that maybe that's the reason why it's hard for us to even focus on one thing. Hence, it's such a massive scandal because it has so many different facets. And there's no two ways about it. As a student of history, the Profumo scandal back in the 1960s was a big deal because this beast of the Conservative cabinet was sharing a lover with the Russian naval attaché. And that just had massive security implications. And this is on that level, on so many different levels. It kind of shows us that how powerful Mandelson was, how duplicitous he was, and how the veneer is so thin when it comes to government secrets.
We talk about this a lot on Mid-Atlantic, but in terms of the Labour inner circle, I think it's very clear Mandelson was playing from a different playbook. And we know, both from the emails that we've seen, but also by the people who went to Epstein's island, that the billionaire's operating manual is very, very different than what effectively is a let's help the working class mandate that the Labour Party stands for. Now, the context at the time, of course, was that Labour was, New Labour was gradually moving further right. But again, the question is, what did Labour stand for at the relevant time, and how did that sit against Mandelson's expediency? And we all know that Gordon Brown, even in the last few days, has come out all guns blazing because it is very, very clear that Mandelson crossed many lines that he ought not to have done as a person, as a civil servant. He definitely ought not to have done as a leader in the party for his own self-respect and judgment. And I think his willingness to be expedient for his own personal gain has come up over and over and over again. And the reason that we're having problems with that is because the reason that a lot of the Labour Party members at the moment are being criticised is because they're playing from exactly the same playbook. And it's uncomfortable because it's discordant with what Labour is supposed to be about collectivism and unity and for the good of all. And we're speaking into this individualistic culture where what it means to be a politician is to dispense with this idea of duty and honor and legacy, and to instead embrace this role of I must look after myself and I must ensure that I can go as far as I can go. And we don't know how to deal with that because that's the conflict that we're having as a society. So I think it'd be interesting to see what comes out of the criminal investigation. But I also think that Mandelson is not alone in his approach here. I think he's just been found out.
I think I'd slightly disagree with you. I think what Mandelson does typify or exemplar for is toesing up to millionaires and billionaires, which the average Labour MP doesn't, in the way that, let's say, your average Tory MP might. So he always felt very different, and all of this behavior just kind of shone a light on the fact that he's very comfortable going down to Caribbean exclusive islands and shopping with millionaires, billionaires, and he's part of that Davos set. If you are the Labour MP for Batley and Dewsbury, you're not hanging out with that Davos set. That's one of the reasons why. So in that regard, I slightly disagree with you. But Mike, you've been waiting there patiently. I do want to bring you in on this. Us Brits have got rather exercised that this former government minister, cabinet minister, former UK ambassador to the US, had such close ties, was given, in effect, state secrets, embargoed government decisions to Epstein, and people are calling for his head. He is resigned from the House of Lords. People want to strip him of his peerage. This is a level of outrage and moral outrage which we have for a political figure in Britain, which there's many figures in the United States who were as close to Epstein, if not closer, who seem to, their heads are not on the chopping block as they are in Britain. Why is that?
Somewhere along the way, we lost our sense of shame as a nation, culturally. There's a lot of reasons historically about why we go into that, but the sort of the sense of shame that was brought over by the Calvinist Protestants in our founding years from the UK has drifted away. And, I think there's still entities within the country that care about that sort of thing, but it's definitely not this current administration. And it isn't deep enough within the general public to cause others to sort of raise the hue and cry. So yes, you'll get newspaper articles or podcast mentions of these people and tisks. But as you can see from our lack of action, there's no fundamental heartbreak or indignity or anger about those folks enough to do anything about it. Yeah.
No, I think that's super interesting. And my sense is that the US is just much more divided still than the UK. And when you're so polarized, you just only look at things, actually interesting, like people in politics do, as my team versus your team. And you're unable to kind of have that shared sense of, actually, we all agree this is a bit off, this is a bit wrong. And I think the overarching feeling in Britain, yes, there's some polarization, but it's actually just a bit of disgust and anger and distrust of elites. And I actually think that here you can have that kind of collective sense of, oh, this is awful, or this lot all look off, everything looks dodgy here. Whereas I suspect maybe in the States that one side is saying the other side's bad and the other side's saying they're bad, and there's not that shared sense of actually this whole thing's rotten.
To that point, I thought it was really quite marked. Yes, Nigel Farage and elements of the Conservative Party said, there needs to be a criminal investigation. But to your point, all the Labour backbenchers were saying exactly the same thing. Yeah. This is absolutely as united the political class in the UK, that this man cannot step aside out of this as easily as he has other scandals. This is obviously the end of Peter Mandelson, but actually there needs to be some level of a reckoning. But sorry, Mike, you were going to say something before I jumped in.
But when was the last time you had neither a Conservative nor a Tory government in place? Or, sorry, not a Conservative nor Labour.
The 1920s under Lloyd George.
Yeah, and who was he a member of?
Liberal Party.
Okay. And that was 100 years ago for 4 to 8 years, something like that.
Yeah.
Yeah. So I hear the comments that you're not a two-party system, but when it comes to power in your country, you effectively are a two-party system. And on those occasions where you actually have to deign to let someone in, like Cameron did with the Lib Dems, it doesn't really end well for anybody. So I'm not sure. I'd have to argue more about that point.
My argument was less that our politics isn't polarized, but the public are not as partisan. They're not as identifying with one side or another. They're able to say, actually, I don't agree with this, even
Right.
if they voted for Labour. Even Labour supporters will be saying that. And that, I think, speaks to what you were saying, Roifield, why Labour MPs, credit to them for saying that over the last couple of days. But also, I think the pressure on them from the public is to do that. It is not to play to a base in the way that it might play out, say, with Republicans in the US.
Yeah, and that perfectly sums up probably the distinction and the reasoning why we're different. We have politicians who really no longer care about the public. They just don't. And that's pretty much on both sides. Again, you know, your representative numbers in terms of population to representative is still low comparative to ours. So for every US representative we have 780,000 citizens, right? Which is the size of Seattle. So when you have those kind of numbers and you have the kind of money in politics that we're talking about, it becomes hard because we are now just evidentiary. We are now in the stage where we have a president closely affiliated with a pedophile and several other members of that pedophile circle, and there's nothing being done about it. The act of labor of standing up and saying, hey, this isn't okay, regardless of whose side it's on, isn't happening within the GOP. They're not doing that. And I think when you realize that not even pedophilia can get them to contradict their president, then we have truly lost the plot, as you all say. You know, it's funny, the projection is so crazy because they'll always come on these shows and the conservatives will say, well, you know, something about what if Clinton's in the files? You know, you would not, if Clinton's in these files, you wouldn't want these files released. And every single Democrat, and I truly believe this in heart, like, yeah, no, let the chips fall where they may. If Clinton was in them, then let's prosecute him like we do everybody else. And we haven't, and that's to me is one of the key differences between the parties. When Hunter Biden was in trouble, it was like, okay, great, let him go before court, let him do his thing. If he's in trouble, prosecute him. If he committed a crime, we don't get it. We don't get that we can do no wrong mentality, as evidenced by the number of times we've forced out Democrats for rather minor offenses compared to what the GOP has done.
Will Keir Starmer ride this out? And if so, how? Leah Brown.
So the short answer is I think he has to, because as we saw with the recent keeping out of Andy Burnham in the Gorton and Denton race, we have a successor problem. We also have an impending local election problem. And I think the sentiment on the ground is we want him gone, but to remove him today would be more disruptive than to sit with it until we get our ducks in a row and come up with an orderly transition plan. And I think there's been a lot of commentary about this whole ATMP process and the kind of inability to change your vote until your candidate's been knocked out, and the lack of transparency on the process for removing Keir Starmer from his role. But I think the short answer to your question is he should resign, but he won't. And so I think the question is whether public sentiment matches his MP's sentiment, and eventually his downfall becomes a much sooner inevitability than he expects.
Steve O'Neill.
I essentially agree with all that. I don't know if I go as far as saying he should resign. I think where that analysis is dead right is that I will call it a psychodrama problem, in the sense that every week, was it last week, Burnham? And before Christmas or something else, there's always a slightly febrile talk about, oh, we can't go on. And we had this last government with the Tories, and okay, they got rid of a couple of prime ministers, but you'd have the same chatter week to week and things wouldn't happen. And I'm a bit grumpy about it, and I've had enough hearing psychodrama, and I'll believe it when I see it, basically. There is not a clear plan to get someone else in. I think it'd be a damaging process to do it. So this idea that it's going to happen before the May local elections, I'm pretty skeptical of. After that, let's see where those chips fall. It wouldn't surprise me if he went on even to the next election, although that is quite a long way away, and it's quite hard to see. That does feel like a stretch, but as I say, I will believe it when I see it at this point, because the amount of times that the tweets and the podcasts and everything else is saying, oh, he can't possibly go on. It's very febrile. Well, it's febrile every week and it goes on. So that's my curmudgeonly take.
Mike Donoghue, what says you from the other side of the Atlantic?
Yeah, I think to Leah's point, I think the backbenchers or the organizing committee or whomever the powers be, they're going to agree with her that, okay, if we get rid of this guy, who's going to replace him, right? Who can we replace him with that, either A, hasn't been tainted with their own scandal, or B, isn't unknown, or whatever. So I think they don't get away with doing that without damaging the party further, I don't think. But I will say that this has really been caused by Keir Starmer's softness. He's soft. He's not a tough leader. And I'm sorry if that offends anybody, but he's not. If you look at the number of people that Johnson was affiliated with that really didn't have any big impact on his ouster, right? The Lebedev stuff or the Arcuri stuff, or all the other people that were floating around him that had their own little personal scandals. What killed Johnson was the COVID-19 Partygate situation, because he didn't care. Like, it only impacts you if you let it impact you, kind of. And the party, he had enough strength in the party to keep those people from doing anything about him. So I don't know. Long story. I think he'll stay, but he'll only stay because the party knows a replacement would be probably worse long term.
I don't know if I agree with any of what you all said here. Labour is dead in the water in these May elections. We all know this, right? We all know this. There's going to be a bloodbath, the length and breadth of the UK. Labour MPs know it. We all know it. So it seems to me that you have the ideal opportunity, if you are a Labour MP, to put the knife, not even in the back of Keir Starmer, in his chest, look him in the eye and say, absolutely not, because the prospects of the party can't get any worse. They can't get any worse. And to your point, Steve, about the febrile atmosphere of British politics, absolutely. We have still not recovered politically from Brexit and how that has destabilized our political establishment. And the reason why we have not recovered is because we are immeasurably poorer, and we have this low burning economic crisis in the country, which has now led to a crisis of confidence in so many different ways. The country is massively crying out for decisive leadership, and it can see this on the two political poles. Zach Polanski seems to be able to say things in a very clear and concise way. Ditto Nigel Farage. You don't have to agree what either of them say, but they don't feel cut from the same cloth as the political establishment. If I was a Labour MP, I'd be putting that knife into Keir Starmer's chest, looking him in the eye and saying, you might have won us an election, but you won that by default because the previous lot was so odious. We need new leadership. And I know it feels very the Conservatives from 2016 to 2024, but that's where we are in Britain. We are crying out for bold leadership that can actually look us in the eye and say, there's a crisis here. We've got to stop dodging it. Let's try and build this country back together. And that ain't Keir Starmer. He's a technocrat. You got a technocrat in Canada, Mark Carney. But what he's able to do is articulate a vision. We have a technocrat over here who cannot. And I just think, get rid of him. But then again, I'm going to vote Green unless something wildly happens in the Labour Party. I'm so disillusioned. Anyway, on that note, everybody, this has been your second Mid-Atlantic this week. I've been joined by Steve O'Neill in London, by Leah Brown in Broadstairs, and my good friend Mike Donoghue in Los Angeles. Just very quickly, Steve, how can people catch you on social media?
Steve Zero Neil, mostly on LinkedIn these days.
Leah Brown, same question to you, my friend.
At Leah Talks on Instagram and TikTok, and Leah Brown, FRSA, on LinkedIn.
And Mike Donoghue, what social media platforms are you lurking on these days?
I'm Mike DSD on TikTok.
There you go. There's been your panel. I've been Roifield Brown. Take care. Look after yourselves. And no doubt in another 3 or 4 days, we'll have another rip-roaring, barnstorming episode of British or American politics to commentate on. But my God, is the world not progressing at 1,000 miles an hour? Take care. Look after yourselves. Bye-bye.